My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, I've been pointing out to you that Paul, in his dialogue, in his debate with the scoffers at 1 Corinthians 15, who denied the resurrection of the dead ones, Paul used the present passive indicative to say over and over again, 10 times, Paul used the present passive indicative to say that the dead ones were being raised at the time he wrote. Now look, let me reiterate. If Paul has in mind the general resurrection of all of the dead who have ever lived in the history of mankind, and he says the dead are being raised, that demands that the dead all around the world, it demands that at Corinth and at Jerusalem and Athens and wherever, were actively being raised from the dead. Now let me ask you a question. If Paul's talking about physical death, physical resurrection, and he says the dead are being raised, how could the scoffers deny that? Why didn't Paul say, look, you scoffers, you're denying the resurrection of the dead ones, but they're being raised. Are you not aware? Have you not walked out to the cemeteries and seen people coming out of the physical graves? Folks, the use of the present passive indicative here is extremely, extremely powerful. Another point. I touched on this ever so briefly yesterday, and that is that when we look at Paul's use of the Greek tenses, it's not arbitrary, it's not sloppy, it's not capricious, and it's not, quote, incidental. And what's fascinating to me is that even the enemies of covenant eschatology, in their arguments on 1 Corinthians chapter 15, they go to the Greek tenses, boy, and they say, we have to honor the Greek tenses. Now let me give you a good example of that. Again, that I mentioned briefly, that I just want to drive this home. Notice that Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15:27, he has put, now that's in the aorist or the past tense, all things under his feet. Well, had Christ put all things under his feet or not? Look, you go to the commentaries and the commentaries say, well, what we have here is an already but not yet. Aha! Thank you very much. I agree with that. Watch this. Verse 25. While in the next verse he will say, he has put all things under his feet, aorist tense. Now he says he must reign, which is in the present infinitive, meaning he must continue to reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. Well, Paul, you're going to say in verse 27, he has put all things under his feet. No, it's an already, but not yet. It is a process that had begun, a process that was present, i.e., he was in the process as he was ruling, as he was reigning. He was in the process of putting down his enemies. And it was a future. Now, if we are going to admit and emphasize he has put all enemies under his feet, honoring the Greek tense, and if we are going to say and admit and emphasize that when Paul says he must reign, and I know Kenneth Gentry does this, Gary DeMar does this, other scholars do this, they point to the present infinitive. He must continue to reign. Okay, if we're going to emphasize the present infinitive of what Christ was doing at that very time, i.e. reigning at the right hand of the throne on high, then how in the name of reason, how in the name of logic, do we also say, oh, well, he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet? See, okay, that's future. And then turn right around and say, well, yeah, I know that Paul used the present passive indicative to speak of what was happening right then, which the right then was when Christ was sitting on the throne, ruling and reigning over his enemies, putting his enemies under his feet. And we deny, I should say the scoffers deny, the present passive indicative. Folks, if the aorist is valid and to be honored, if the present is valid and to be honored, if the future is valid and to be honored, then the present passive indicative is valid and must be honored. If not, why not? It is surely a strained hermeneutic that says, well, you know, the Corinthians were being, present passive indicative, saved. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 2. And Christ had put all things under his feet, and we got to honor that. And he would continue to reign, present infinitive, and we have to honor that. Until he has put, future tense, all things under his feet, and we must honor that. Oh, but even though he uses the present passive indicative 10 times, and he uses the present indicative once at least, we don't have to pay attention to the tenfold use of the present passive indicative. I'm going to share with you that, guess what? 1 Corinthians 15 has a direct parallel from a major resurrection text found in the Gospels, that no one denies the already, the ongoing, and the not yet. We'll see you on the flip side.